Hey, this is Jason from ConveYour, and I want to introduce you to an interview where ConveYour's president and founder, Stephen Rhyne, talks to Stephen Shapiro. Stephen Shapiro is an innovation instigator, Hall of Fame speaker, and author. He's known for working with NASA, Nike, and Johnson & Johnson, amongst others. His latest books are Best Practices Are Stupid and Personality Poker. So the aim of this discussion was to get Stephen Shapiro to talk about changes in the world of business that require innovation. What's great about this dialogue is that they cover hindrances as well. Along with the problems that they talk about, simple solutions are offered. So I hope that you benefit from this conversation by applying the principles that are offered. Enjoy.
So, Stephen, like as leaders of a company, we kind of have bifocals, right? We have to have bifocals. We have to think about the things currently, drill down into the company and think about the things that we need to change right now. And then we have to think far off and look at the things that are coming. So what are some of the big changes in the world that are requiring us to think about innovation differently or change the way we approach innovation?
Well, I think one of the key things to understand is that expertise can be the enemy of innovation. The more you know about your industry, your function, your discipline, the harder it is for you to think differently about it. And so what ends up happening is our past experiences lead us down the path of incremental innovation, which is critically important. But the problem is, if we are only improving at an incremental level, the world outside of our organization is changing at a much faster pace. And so we're not able to keep up. Our incremental change will never be enough to keep us going in the right direction, because we have new disruptive technologies and new disruptive economics that are going to impact every company, whether it's technology such as 3D printing, AI, or blockchain, or it could be shifts in buyer expectations and behaviors, such as the millennials and the Gen Zs, but also just the fact that now you can order a package and have it delivered to your house in an hour. So all these things are shifting expectations. And if we're not staying on top of those disruptive technologies and those changing expectations, we're going to be out of business.
So it's not so much getting into a group or getting into a room and with the experts and talking about their expertise, right?
Yeah, I mean, because one of the things that we find is that if we are hanging around with people who are similar to us, we will get high levels of successful innovation. It just will tend to be, again, that incremental innovation. And sort of those bifocals you were talking about, look, we need to focus on the present day. We need to satisfy our customers' needs today. We need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to meet those current expectations. But the problem is those expectations are going to be different in the long term, in the distance. And if we're not shifting enough so that when we get to that future destination, that time in the future when people have a different expectation, you're going to be like a Sears or a Toys R Us or one of these other companies that was hugely successful, and now they're either gone or on life support.
All right, so that kind of leads into my next question, which was kind of if you could fast forward in the future, see the winners and the losers, okay, and then go look at what the winners. We already knew what the winners are. We could see the future, and we went and looked at what they're doing in their meetings or their groups. What are the winners' behavior right now, and what are the behaviors of the, I hate to say losers, but what are the people that are not getting it behaving like right now?
Well, I think it comes back to your bifocals. I really like that. You can't be like the Red Sox just won the World Series. Go Red Sox. you can't be hitting, going up there and only, looking for home runs, because obviously you're going to lose if that's all you're going for. So we need the singles, the doubles, the triples. We need all of those types of things. And so innovation is a portfolio of change. And so the companies that will be successful are the ones that recognize that, embrace that, and recognize that those more discontinuous changes, the more radical changes, can't be built in the mindset and the model that's been used in the past. So they need to fundamentally shift the way they think about innovation. The ones that are going to struggle are the ones who, first of all, are complacent. They believe that what they've done in the past will lead to their success. It might be an ego thing because they believe we are big and successful and therefore, we don't have to change. They're going to be in trouble. It really is just about recognizing the fact that whatever you think makes you great made you great. Doesn't necessarily make you great in the future. And we need to constantly be questioning everything that we're doing to make sure that we're staying relevant. Because at the end of the day, I know we use the word innovation a lot, but to me, the key is adaptability and relevance. We want to change in a way that makes us relevant in the eyes of the market. And that to me is the name of the game.
What is the default behavior you see, an organization or a department use when they have to solve a problem that requires, some innovative change? What's kind of like the default, the kind of just what people pick up over time, and they say, this is how we tackle a problem. What does that usually look like?
Yeah, so most of the time people do something like brainstorming. So they'll get people in a room with a flip chart and Post-it notes. And the problem that we have with most innovation efforts is they're focused on ideas and solutions, not on questions. So the default mechanism is, if you think about how most companies, when they say, let's go innovate, what they do is they create the equivalent of a suggestion box. Now, it might not be a physical box. It's probably, a nice sophisticated computer system, but we're asking people for their opinion, suggestions, and ideas. So what ends up happening is we create a lot of wasted energy, because if you look at a traditional suggestion box, we know that less than 1% of the ideas that are submitted into suggestion boxes have any value, which means that at least 99% of your time is spent focusing on work that doesn't create value. And that's not really what an organization needs to do. So the default mechanism is to focus on ideas, focus on solutions. We need to step back and ask better questions, more important questions, differentiating questions, questions that are going to help us stand out, and then reframe those questions in a way that we can unleash greater potential for innovation.
That's so true. Questions are basically creating the future. So the quality of your question, right? So this friend of mine is involved in this concept of appreciative inquiry, right? So the questions are like the value of a question, and the words matter so much. For example, if I said, what's the problem here? How do we fix the problem? Versus if we could wave a magic wand around this, right? So just the change in how people think when they're not thinking about the current status quo, and how do we remove that status quo versus what it could be. It's just amazing how you stack up words can change the discussion, right?
Totally. I mean, in one word can fundamentally change the direction of things. So like when NASA, they were trying to, send people up into space, and one of the things they wanted to do is they wanted to get clothes clean. So if you think about what that means, it's about cleaning fluids and things of that nature. But you could go from how do we get clothes clean to how do we keep clothes clean. One word, we unleash a completely different range of potential solutions, because now we're looking at a material science problem. We also know that changing the words, as you pointed out, can change our emotion, not just the types of solutions, but our feeling about the problem. And so we can shift emotion very easily, like what should we be doing versus what we should not be doing. Adding that one word not can change emotion, but it also can fundamentally change the direction of the work.
If you could describe the promised land, like the innovation promised land, right? And you've got organizations accomplishing and getting results as the result of changing the way they approach innovation. That portfolio of innovation. What does that look like? Could you show it? Explain to us some things that you've seen, or from your experiences working with your customers, that you've seen that have just been demonstrably better because of the practices they've put into place.
Right. So when you ask the question about default methods, the default approach is what I'd call idea-driven innovation. So it's about that suggestion box mentality. So what I suggest companies focus on is something called challenge-centered innovation. And basically, we're flipping the entire process upside down. Idea-driven innovation, basically, if you think about it as a funnel, ideas come in at the top. Most of those aren't good, so now we have to go evaluate them and eliminate the ones that we don't want to do. And now the next step is we have to take the ideas that we like, and we need to somehow find somebody who's going to sponsor it and fund it. So we are wasting a lot of energy, a lot of time, and even the good ideas often wither on the vine. So challenge-centered innovation says we're not starting with ideas, we're starting with questions. We're starting with important questions, differentiating questions, well-framed questions. And before we spend any time trying to find a solution to the question, to the problem, we make sure we have the owner, sponsor, funding, and resources. we have evaluation criteria that allows us to be objective. When we find a good solution, we have everything in place to move forward. And it also allows us to look externally for solutions, not just internally like most suggestion boxes operate. And what we've seen is when you use this challenge-centered mindset, you will increase innovation ROI a minimum of 10-fold over traditional methods, because you eliminate the wasted energy, you speed up the process, and you're finding solutions and implementing solutions at a much greater pace.
Wow. Okay, so is it more of a let's all align on the problem, or let's all align on the challenge first? If we align on that, then the ideas will come as a result. Maybe. So instead of this, hey, we have this great idea, it managed to get through the Fermi barrier, so to speak, and then you've got this one idea. Now you have to campaign for that idea. You have to go around campaigning when everybody's going like, what problem does this solve? What's the challenge? You know, so it's a little bit, I could see how flipping it around, getting everybody to understand the challenge for now or in the future, and then coming up with that. It's just, yeah, it's great. So you don't need me to tell you it's great, but you understand what it's saying.
Well,
that's great.
I just want to say, you know, you're spot on there, because what you're basically saying is it improves collaboration. Ideas, we don't tend to collaborate around ideas.
Right.
I've got an idea, and I go off and I pursue it, and I try to promote it, and I try to sell it. But with challenges, which are issue, problems, or opportunities, we can now collaborate around those. So everybody can look at the problem from a different lens, a different angle. Okay, well, what's the financial implications of this problem? What are the operational implications of this problem? What are the production challenges associated with this problem? So we can look at it from all those different angles and now increase the collaboration and the acceleration of our innovation.
Would you say that focusing on challenges first is more objective, in that an idea, you can kind of construe the problem to meet the idea, whereas a challenge focused first, everyone can understand where that challenge applies to them in their position.
Yeah, because look, we always, in organizations, we've always said, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. But look, we can find solutions very quickly when you use a specific methodology that I have. But it's the problem that is the actual challenge. I mean, coming up with the right question is much more difficult than people think, and it's a combination of art and science. And so what happens is when you have ideas, it quite often is my personal opinion of what I think will be valuable, as opposed to looking at it from a bigger picture and trying to determine this really is important. Now, one of the problems that you run into is you need to make sure that the people who are asking the questions aren't the experts. So we do have to have a process to recognize that if expertise is the enemy of innovation, then the types of questions we will naturally ask are going to be past-based questions. So what we need to do is also look externally for help with framing future-based questions. How do we need to be positioned in the future, and and what specifically do we need to have in place in order to make that successful?
That's great. A question about, are you seeing a change in the hierarchy or the politics of innovation in companies? And, you know, maybe in the past, we'd have more of a top-down approach, right? So we would have, you know, give me all of your ideas, and then you have a, you know, select few at the top, kind of sifting through those ideas, and then again another cycle of, you know, we're gonna tell you, you know, what we're doing based off of those ideas.
I mean, look, in some respects, there's still some things which are a little bit top down. I mean, look, ideas are still an attempt. I mean, that's Innovation 1.0. Ideas are still an attempt to get everybody engaged. So we are, at least, it's not like saying the top is saying, these are the things we need to do, now go execute. That would be a top down approach. At least with ideas, we're saying, well, we want your ideas and we will choose the ones that we think are best. And that's, the reality is it's almost always going to be that way to some degree. The question is, who is determining what is best? So as I said, there's evaluation criteria for every challenge, but we also have evaluators. And we need to be careful in selecting the evaluators so that confirmation bias doesn't set in. And we're now only choosing, you know, ideas or solutions to the questions that fit our mental model. So the evaluation process is important, and it's not voting. We could talk a long time about why voting doesn't work. It is really something fundamentally different that we need. So I do see organizations allowing this to happen. And a lot of it is just recognizing that there's value that comes from anyone and everyone in an organization. And it's not just the few people who are in the laboratories with the long white coats that are the smart ones. It's everybody needs to contribute, but they need to be contributing in the right way, in the right place.
Yeah. If you're coming to an organization, what's maybe a counterintuitive thing that they might see that they're not used to?
I think a lot of the things are actually counterintuitive. So, for example, most people say think outside the box. That's sort of the default definition of innovation. Mm-hmm. The reality is, and we can dig as deep as you want into this, when we create levels of abstraction in a problem, which basically means thinking outside of the box, we actually reduce the quality and the relevance of the solutions. So it's not about thinking outside the box. The goal is to find a better box. So if we're spending time trying to get clothes clean, we might not be thinking about how to keep clothes clean. If we're focused on, what features should we add, we might not be thinking about what features should we remove. So these subtle changes, that different box, not a bigger box or outside the box, but a different box will be the key to unleashing, because as we make them too abstract, we actually reduce the quality of our innovation efforts.
Wow, I never thought about that. If you think about it, like plotting it on a graph, you could be pointing and looking down at this thing and saying, "Oh, this is the thing. We need to get really far away and get very abstract about this problem here." And you're looking here when really the opportunity's over in this area, and so you're trying to get further and further away and think of it more, in a more esoteric way or something like that. And like you're saying, you might be distancing from the actual implementation. Is that what you're kind of saying?
Yeah, okay, it reminds me of an old joke. I mean, basically, walking around the street one late at night, you're walking around, you see somebody like under a street lamp looking around for something. You go up to him and say, "Okay, well, what are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, I'm looking for my keys." It's like, "Oh, is this where you lost them?" It's like, "No, I lost them over there, but the light's good over here." And that's what we tend to do. We tend to focus where the light is, and the light might be our past experiences or our understanding or our area of expertise. But the solution is actually going to be somewhere else. And we need to make sure we're looking somewhere else to get to those solutions.
Wow. And that comes back to that expertise thing. Sometimes we hit that 90% and we're drawing on just the experts, right? And so there's these large kind of low hanging fruit in some other area, but we don't actually, that's not in our culture, or it's not part of our expertise. And so we're not actually looking at either, like you said, outside or inside. Are we looking outside for ways to solve problems in this area? That's so great. Well, so one big area for us, for me, is helping organizations, figure out how to do training in a better way. How to engage, train, and influence their people with ConveYour. And what I found is, we tout the idea of being objective about the training. So rather than building abstract knowledge, where you're simply just putting things in a knowledge base and saying, "Hey, if you need this resource, go find it." Think in terms of, backfilling what you actually need. So if you think of it more like a marketing campaign, okay? Assume you don't have a captive audience. Assume that you have to re-engage them every day. And what do I need? If you think about it as a funnel, I need this new behavior. I need a behavior in a certain spot. How do I create that behavior? We're obviously having a funnel drop in this behavior in this position or in this division of the company. And that's really hard. When you think about how do you drive a new behavior, and how do you, it could be simple as just surfacing the training that they need, but I want to be able to have customers have a way to think about ways they could innovate on driving a new behavior, right? And so really, like you said, what's the challenge? What's the challenge here? And then how do we come up with ideas to solve that challenge, that problem? Rather than the typical, like, I have content, I'm going to throw it in. And if it, we'll throw it up against the wall and see if it helps, solve this problem over here. I just want to create a way for, they have the tools, they have the easel, right? But they need a better way of constructing the problem and then coming up with a solution. So I'm wondering if, you built the 30-day innovation challenge on ConveYour. It's fantastic, it's had great success. And I'd love to hear how you thought about that problem, right? In terms of your business and what you decided to do to solve that problem and how you approached the innovation, with that. So maybe if you could just go through a little bit about, your background as a professional speaker, CSP, and trainer, why you built the 30-Day Innovation Challenge, and then what you maybe some tips or some ways you could offer, help our customers listening to this.
Right. So, it's interesting. One of my innovation frameworks, in fact, it's in the first chapter of my latest book. I talk about there's 3 levels of innovation. There's innovation as an event, there's innovation as a process, and then there's innovation as a system. So innovation as an event is the suggestion box. It's ad hoc, it's unpredictable. We innovate when somebody has an idea. Innovation as a process is where there's a start and a finish. It starts with a question and ends with the implementation of value. And system is where it's part of our DNA. And when I looked at the profession of speaking, it's 100% innovation as an event. It's all about the event. It's all about the conference. It's all about the speech. I leave the speech, boom, thank you, mic drop, everybody's happy. But they're not, because innovation as an event is the lowest level of innovation. So what I started to think about was, how do we use the event as not the end, but rather the start of a process? Mm-hmm. And so I had a client, you and I have been working together for ages now on this. And I had a client who said, look, we get people together, these executives together for a week. They leave the week. We've tried anything and everything to keep them engaged after they leave. Nothing has worked. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to make this work. I'm going to figure something out, and came up with a design for the 30-Day Innovation Challenge, which is basically gamification with questions and videos. Short micro learning. It takes less than 90 seconds a day. So what would happen is I leave the stage, and everybody in the audience would get an email or a text message, depending on how they signed up. And then in that would be a question about something that I talked about, or something I didn't have time to talk about but is important. And they will get points based on how accurately and how quickly they respond. And then once they get it right, up pops a video, and then there's a leaderboard. Here's what we found is, when we used this approach of gamification and just 90 seconds a day, we went from no participation to 95% participation each and every day for 30 days by busy executives who in the past would never have done anything. And so I think it's the combination of the brevity, the competition, even though they got a prize, the prize was like a $50 Kindle. It was, nobody was going to spend any amount of time trying to get a $50 Kindle, but to be in the top of the leaderboard at the end of the 30 days and bragging rights, it made a huge difference. And then what's also really cool with this then is you can now start diagnosing where there are gaps in knowledge. Like, where do they struggle? What questions were they struggling with? Then you can go back and say, 30% of the people struggled with this question. Here are some tools that might be beneficial, or here's, maybe we need to dig a little deeper into this and diagnose what's actually going on here. So it's not just a gamification tool, it's also a diagnostic tool that becomes very powerful.
Yeah, the concept of learner trust is one that we throw around. And with the short brevity of the videos, right, where you're backfilling the right answer, and the fact that it's not a lot of time in each day, but you're keeping top of mind, right? You're keeping that dialogue going. This concept of learner trust and not breaking that. There's so many other places where we get content where it's like, oh, that's going to be a hour-long video, or that's a 15-minute, 20-minute blog post, right? That I really feel like you just nailed it with the really short microlearning format, and the fact that leaderboard, this kind of social engineering there with the fact that it's a $50 Kindle, but yet these people are hopping in and checking out the leaderboard constantly to see where they're at. I just love it. So what would you say?
If I could just add one other quick thing with this too, is I think the other thing which really works about is, if you think about traditional e-learning, the way most e-learning platforms operate is we teach you something and then we quiz you when you're done. And we've almost flipped it on its head, because instead of showing you the video and saying, what did you learn from the video? We ask you the question. It might have been something I talked about during the speech. But it might not have been, because the 30 questions, we don't have enough time to cover all of it. So we flipped it on its head. So we're testing your current knowledge on the topic. And then only when you get it right do we show you this 60-second video that tells you why that was the right answer and the other ones were wrong. And it's a fundamentally different way in terms of the way you engage people. So it's just so many different ways it's different.
Yeah, so you nailed it on this concept that we have always thought of testing as a measurement tool rather than a learning tool. So that's why we have so much conflict in schools and everything about the concept of testing sometimes, because they think of it only as measurement. Okay, so learn all this content and then I'm going to send you this quiz afterwards and I'm going to measure whether you learned it. So we remember things best right before we're going to forget them, right? It's science. So the concept of having them test themselves makes them remember it just from the very, if you never measured it, there was no leaderboard, there's still benefit in running it as the challenge, right? As the challenge question format. So yeah, that's great. If you were going to say, if you were going to give some tips without going out, of course, this is without somebody coming on site, right? Having you come on site and building a challenge with them or building courseware with them, what would be some good questions, right? Around formulating the next training or course or engagement for their people. Could you help my customers, right? Think of ways they can tackle this problem, right? Because they get this great tool with ConveYour to build content, but they need to think of ways to say, okay, here's our challenge. I know you can't say it all in one video, right? It's a lot, right? But maybe it's resources. Maybe you could say, hey, I would highly recommend checking out this resource and then using that lens to think about your training, okay? I'd recommend my book on this. Read this book and then you'll have a better understanding. Walk me through that process. What would you say to our customers?
Sure. And I think it's less an innovation question and more of an education question. And so as you know, I'm using ConveYour for a new product that I've launched called Innovation Intervention. And basically what we do with that is it's a little different than the 30-day innovation challenge, which was sort of that short burst. This is a deep dive 8-week long program. And one of the things which I found in putting people through it and learning what's working and what's not working is that the key is to have people feel engaged. So most of the time when we do these types of courses, e-learning courses just pumping out content and it's a one-way conversation with maybe a quiz. This is a two-way dialogue. So each week there is I call it a deliverable because I come from the world of consulting. So there's a deliverable that has to get created. And so the person who's going through the process, the program creates the deliverable. We give them all the templates and the tools for it. And then they submit it to me and I evaluate it. And I don't evaluate it like with a red pen, but I say, hey, this is great. Have you considered this? What about that? Now it's a high touch approach, but I find that it gives people an incredible amount of value that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So that sort of giving them a mission, something they need to go do with their team, knowing that there's accountability somewhere on the back end of it, whether it's submitting it to me or something else. It could be submitting it to somebody else in the team, doesn't matter. Having that accountability for specific deliverables, I think drives learning as opposed to, hey, here's content, here's content, here's content, go figure out what you're gonna do with it.
So if someone wanted to really to start understanding how they can influence their organization around innovation, okay, and start practicing the way you say they should be practicing, where should they start?
The easiest thing is my book, Best Practices Are Stupid. That's probably the first place. It's basically just 40 bite-sized tips on how to create a culture of innovation. And so there are topics in there around asking better questions. There's topics around there on differentiation. There's topics around breakthrough thinking and how do you shift your mindset. And there's topics around testing, experimentation, and their relationship to failure. So look, innovation isn't the same as creativity. And I think this is an important point. I think creativity is actually killing innovation. I think we've spent so much time focused on quantity of ideas. Every idea is a good idea that we're imploding from the weight of all of this wasted energy. We want laser focus. We want to innovate where we differentiate. We want to focus on what matters most and put our innovation energies there. And so the process that I lay out inside of Best Practices Are Stupid is a good starting point. And then I have other tools, whether it's my 22 lenses for reframing challenges, which you can get on my website, or innovation intervention, which is going to be the deep dive into innovation over a course of an 8-week period.
That's fantastic. Stephen, I really appreciate your time. Thanks for walking through my questions here. I really look forward to applying your concepts to help my customers.
Yeah, and I just want to thank you for everything you do, because ConveYour is a phenomenal platform. There are things that I do that I could never do anywhere else. And so I want to thank you for everything you've done, your responsiveness. It's a beautiful platform. It does so much. And I think the challenge is knowing which pieces to use. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank you, Stephen.
All right, take care.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Hey, thanks for listening in on this discussion between Stephen Rhyne from ConveYour and Stephen Shapiro from StephenShapiro.com. For more information about Stephen Shapiro, visit StephenShapiro.com or find him on Twitter by searching for his handle @StephenShapiro. Be on the lookout for his upcoming book, Invisible Solutions. For more information about Stephen Rhyne and ConveYour, visit ConveYour.com. You can also check out ConveYour's podcast, ConveYour on Learning and Development, by going to podcast.conveyor.com. Be sure to check us out on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook. You can also find Stephen Rhyne on Twitter by searching for his handle @SRhyne. Again, this is Jason from ConveYour. Until next time, keep up the good work.